again. This is Han. Thanks, Ben. Welcome again. This is Hani Rustom. I'm speaking from Belgium. I'm originally from Syria and Lebanon, somewhere in between. And I'm the founder of and director of Healing on the Move, one of the initiatives supporting and putting together the Alliance, together with my colleague Ben and Chrisine. I will welcome you, Ben, to start us for this session. Thank you.
So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Art Beyond the Edge, Theatre, Music and Emergent Art in the Struggle for Collective Survival. My name is Ben Rivers. I'm from Protest Theatre Alliance. Today, Mark LeVine and Bryan Reynolds will explore what they call art beyond the edge, art forged in situations of extreme violence. The conversation will take us from the rhythms of Kakuma Sound in Kenya to the grassroots activism of Chicoco in Nigeria's waterfront communities, from a powerful theatre project in the Palestinian village of Nabi Saleh, bringing to life the stories of local protesters, to theatre on the front lines of war in Ukraine. Together, we'll be learning how music, theatre, and other forms of cultural resistance keep communities strong, challenge oppression, and give voice to struggles for freedom and dignity. If you have questions, please place them in the chat, and Mark and Bryan will respond towards the end of the talk. A bit about our speakers. Mark and Bryan are two renowned artist scholars with over 25 years of experience in art and performance activism in conflict zones. Mark LeVine is a professor at UC Irvine, California. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, a musician, and an author and editor of 12 books, including We'll Play Till We Die and Art Beyond the Edge with Bryan Reynolds. Mark has collaborated with Ozo Matli, Femi, and Sheun Kuti, and more. Bryan Reynolds is a distinguished and Chancellor's Professor at UC Irvine, Artistic Director of Transversal Theatre Company, and he's an award-winning playwright and scholar. His work has been staged in 70 venues across 19 countries. He's also the author and editor of more than 12 books, bridging theatre, philosophy, and political activism. Today's event is part of a monthly series of teach-ins brought to you by Protest Theatre Alliance in partnership with Healing on the Move and Creativity and Change. Hazel Hurley will be capturing elements of today's event in a graphic harvest that will be shared towards the end of the hour. The talk will be recorded and uploaded to the YouTube channel of Protest Theatre Alliance. I will now hand over to you, Mark.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ben. This is really an honor to be here. I've known you for over a dozen years, and we first met in Palestine, occupied Palestine during the Freedom Bus, I think the first or second run. And it was really a life-changing experience for me, even though by then I'd been working in Palestine 20 years, almost 15 or 20 years. So it's really a pleasure to be here. It's in a way a culmination for me, and perhaps also for Bryan, of 15 years of work together, traveling around the world, looking together and participating in, collaborating with, and researching what we call art beyond the edge. As Ben had explained it, art that's created in conflict zones or moments and places of intense conflict or intense suffering, aftermaths of different kinds of tragedies or different kinds of environmental disasters that we've been unfortunate to have to be at. And we are about to come out with a book in the spring called Art Beyond the Edge, Creativity and Conflict in a World on Fire. And this is kind of a discussion of what led us to this book and what are some of the things we think that are most useful for other activists, performance activists, and artists who want to engage in activism to do in order to perhaps make the art they're creating more efficacious, more powerful, or make the activism, bring an aesthetic component to activism that can be more deeply transformative, or what we call transversal. Um, I think I'll take some of my time just to talk about how I got there and how we got to the moment where Bryan and I were both standing in a field with you, Ben, in Nabi Saleh, a small West Bank village, a frontline village in occupied Palestine, where for many years there were weekly protests on Fridays that brought together local and international and Israeli activists to fight the occupation. It's a place I'd already been to several times before we were there. It was very much inspired by the work of the Freedom Theater, which is also a place that was very dear to me in Jenin. Knowing the backstory, knowing some of the principal people there, and knowing how transformative it was for everyone who participated in, I knew that if Bryan and I could collaborate with you all, it would be really a transformative experience for us, but also perhaps for students at the theater and for any audience we could work with. So that's kind of the immediate background to a play we ultimately created that Bryan wrote and I dramatized called Nabi Saleh, about our experiences. But let me just lead up there for a bit. I mean, for me, coming of age in New York City in the 80s, it was a time where there was still a lot of activism, especially where I lived in Lower East Side, especially against gentrification, against racism, against the police. And it was, and as a musician who was also engaged in all kinds of grassroots activism, bringing the two together was very natural. And then as hip hop takes off in New York before it became too heavily commercialized, it was also very much an activist enterprise, right? Because it was grassroots. It was operating, at least at the beginning, outside of a corporatized environment, so people could be much more powerfully honest with the music and much more critical. Um, you have bands like Boogie Down Production, KRS-One, of course, Public Enemy, all coming out of this moment in New York. And you had also kinds of rock music, Defunct, Living Color, that were coming out that were also really powerful at this time. So this was the start. And then when I went and I had lived in Europe and was performing in Europe, and also saw the much more natural kind of performativity of protests in Europe that hadn't really reached America yet. You know, the last major protest was in Chicago 68, which was a disaster because it became violent and it gave the police exactly what they wanted and helped elect Nixon. So being in Europe and seeing the kind of theatrical, carnivalesque nature of protests already really inspired me as an artist. And then I go to Palestine to do my research for my dissertation in the mid 90s and wind up working with all these amazing Palestinian and Israeli artists who are working together. This is during Oslo. This is the moment where there was supposed to be peace coming. Some of you might have even been there in that period. And you know, you could see that there was always this desire to work together, but you could tell very quickly who was just a poser, who just wanted to do it for the photo op or for the funding, and who was really genuinely involved in this. Because the ones who were genuinely involved were the ones who were looking to create a new identity through the art, that were trying to move beyond this silly idea that Oslo was clearly not ever going to fulfill, of a two-state solution with two territorially sovereign states that could interact as equals. If you lived on the ground there, you knew that was impossible, even from the start. It was a stillborn peace process. And so right away we were trying to understand how could we use art to help fight what was happening, which was in fact an intensification of the occupation during the very years that it was supposed to be moving towards freedom and independence for Palestinians, and some kind of peace between these two countries that were supposed to come into being. So activism, again, artistically grounded activism, especially ones that broke through, that were beyond the edge, and also beyond the edge of identities. In other words, not just Palestinians, not just Israelis, not just others, but working together. Was something that had become very important to me. And of course, that became embodied later on with the Freedom Theater, which was founded by Giuliano Merhamis, as most of you probably know, who was half Israeli and half Palestinian from communist parents. And then Zakaria Zubeidi, who was a Palestinian, one of the founders of, or the leaders of Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. And it was so inspiring for me early on to see how they used art, not to build peace, not instead of conflict, but actually as a tool in conflict, in a liberation struggle. And that was absolutely crucial. And I'm sure for Bryan as well, that art as a key and a tool, a weapon, as Fela Kuti called it, art is the weapon of the future, right? And he said that in the late 70s, 80s. So for me, the future had become the present. And I was always trying to figure out how can you use art as a weapon in struggles for liberation. And that's, I think, what Bryan and I began looking for and began trying to do together when we began traveling first to Iraq in 2013, then very soon after here to Palestine. Then we were in Nigeria, and we were in Port Harcourt in the Niger Delta, in one of the poorest and most ecologically devastated places on earth. And then we just kept going to Kenya and more different places together. But Palestine always remained, as the saying goes, in my heart, and I think his too. So we came back multiple times. And it was during one of the times we were marching with the Freedom Bus, I think our first or second trip, that we were in this field, and maybe we can show just that moment that where this happens, which we happened to capture on video, or someone did. We were in the field during a protest, and the weekly protests in Nabi Saleh were. It's a beautiful little village right across from a stream. It's a frontline area, so it's an area that the Israelis patrol regularly, and they have a lot of it off limits because it's surrounded. The village is surrounded by settlements on the hills, as so many Palestinian villages are in the West Bank. And normally you can move through this space but the moment it becomes politicized, the moment Palestinians go there as a community, the Israelis show up, and then there becomes a conflict. And it was very scripted. After going multiple times together, we could see the script. It felt very theatrical. The field felt like a play, right? In a way, it felt like a theater, a stage, right? And it felt like a stage where something was being staged, where there was a script in a way, because it generally followed the same script. We knew when the lights would come up and when it would go dark. And as long as people stuck within the script, somehow what needed to be accomplished was accomplished without too much brutality, too much violence on the part of the Israelis. There was always some violence. That was, in fact, part of the dynamic. But on a good day, no one got killed. On a bad day, people could get killed. And we felt, and Bryan can say this much more eloquently than can I because he's the theater person, but we felt, we looked at each other once, literally with the tear gas. I'm not trying to make it sound cool or anything, but literally as the tear gas is like around us, and we're just looking at each other saying, excuse my French, holy shit, this is a play. We're in the middle of a play somehow, and play in a whole bunch of senses, in a philosophical sense, in the theatrical sense, in the sense of activism, of the given of the back and forth between an occupying power and people in the middle of resistance. And somehow we can contribute to this through our own creation, our own representation of this on an actual stage. And because the Tamimi family was so beautiful and so inspiring to us and so welcoming. And the first time we were there, I remember after the whole events and everyone's trying to clean their eyes, and we had the most delicious dinner ever. And it was Bilal Tamimi or Bassa Tamimi. They were talking to us. They said, when we are here together, we are not Israelis or Palestinians or internationals. We're all one people. We're really something new. And that's also when it clicked, like through this art, through this occasion, we are creating something beyond anything that existed when we all first came together. And that became a goal, at least for me, of the piece, but also of all art. All activist art has to do something new. It has to put you somewhere beyond you where you were started, in a way you can't come home. You can't go back. What Bryan developed the term transversal, which he could explain more, where it just takes you somewhere. And then if you can develop the art in a creative enough way, you can't go back. It can lead you somewhere. It doesn't just take you away from your old subjective territory or your identity, but it forces you and opens up the possibility of a new identity. And that identity would be one that would help you to move forward to liberation. So I'll just end by saying, there's a very famous African American playwright, Toni Kadebambara, who said something that changed my life. She said, the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible, right? Not inevitable, because nothing can make a revolution inevitable, and it depends on so many other things. But if an artist can make revolution irresistible to whoever's observing or experiencing the art, then we've done our job. And so I think that's what we're all supposed to be trying to do here. And I'll turn it over to Bryan.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe I show the video you mentioned for a couple of seconds. I didn't want to stop you while you were speaking.
So these are the soldiers that are there, that come. That's the main road. The other side is the spring. And that's the hill that you can see for a minute. Yeah. And aside from that, you can also see there'll also be shooting. So they're putting in tear gas, but then they're also shooting at us, projectiles, steel, plastic-coated steel, marbly bullets, and other things. On a good day. On a bad day, they shoot much more lethal projectiles and even more tear gas. So that's kind of what the field looked like that inspired us to think of the terminology that Bryan will explain more. And that's a much younger version of me.
I'm in the background throwing
and there's
up.
Bryan shooting. Yeah. So anyway. That's about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. That was really great. I'm really happy to be here, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I just say, Mark and I kind of began with a question that we wanted to figure out what is the structure? What does it take to make performance activism or activism that uses art effective? I mean, I think that oftentimes people implement some sort of artistic expression in their activist work, and how might this, whatever we characterize as art, let's say, like how might this work to make the political work, have more efficacy, and have more power. And so I think this is generally the question that from which Mark and I began. We had initially started working on child soldiers. We're interested in what made it possible for people to perpetrate such horrific violence on children in Rwanda and Uganda and the Congo. And then when Mohamed Bouazizi in December 2010, I mean, some of you may not know the story, but a street vendor in a small town, Boazid, in Tunisia, who was regularly having money extorted from him from a local municipal official. So he on this day he decided that he just wasn't going to take it anymore. And what would happen was that in the morning he would go and pick up the fruit that he was going to sell, and then like many other vendors, and then during the day you sell your fruit, and at the end of the day you pay for it, and whatever you've made, that's the money you made that day. Well, on this particular day, this official came and said he had to pay. She was extorting money from him. He said no. She took his scale away, so he couldn't weigh the fruit and sell it. And then he went to the local, mayor's office, and yelled that he wanted attention. He wanted the scale back. Nobody got no response. He then went to a gas station, got a container of gasoline, stood in front of the mayor's office, and said, if you don't give me back my scale, I'm going to light myself on fire. He got no response, so he covered himself in gasoline and he lit himself up. And so that moment that was at that point, photographed and filmed, or at least the idea of it went viral, and that ignited, what later became to be known as Arab Spring, the revolution in Tunisia. I mean, in the next 6 months, 107 other people also self-immolated, and that extended into Egypt. And so by the beginning of January 2011, already the Tunisian government had fallen. By January 10th in Tahrir Square, a new revolution was already beginning. So, and then it went from there. So we were interested in that moment, what made his performance, I think we characterize this as a performance, like what made it more successful and so successful compared to other people that have lit themselves on fire, because there's a long tradition of people self-immolating as political protest, but in most cases it does nothing. So it wouldn't be a mode of a protest that Mark and I would recommend. If I suppose if you could do it with guaranteed efficacy, then maybe for some people it would be a worthwhile sacrifice. But in his case, it ended up being very successful, and that was because of the attention that it got. I think also the period in time within which the whole event took place. It was roughly about 45 minutes from the time that his scale is taken away to the time that he's self-immolated. So then Mark and I began to characterize that as a theater of immediacy. It's both urgent and emergent, but it was calculated. He made a speech before he lit himself on fire. People recorded that. So it's all these things, like all the energy, everything that he harnessed around that moment somehow made this more impactful than other instances, or other times when people have done similar things. So let me just hold on to that idea for a moment, because at the time that this happened, we didn't have this in any way figured out. I wouldn't say that we necessarily have anything figured out now, but we have some ideas. And then when we were in Baghdad in May 2013, we were fortunate enough to be present at a protest by an activist group there who was protesting sectarian violence. And so they were giving a protest calling for, a non-sectarian unity within the country of Iraq that was against any kind of sectarian violence, and looking for one nation, all one people. And they really brilliantly, this was really like a turning point for us, theoretically and structurally, in looking at the efficacy of art in protest. What they did is they had huge banners, and on these banners, they had images of soldiers kind of like homosocially engaged, like playfully, kind of erotically rolling on the ground with each other. And they had signs that said Shia, Sunni, Kurd, Christian, suggesting that all the different there together. Excuse me? I heard somebody talking. All the different groups together, and so they were suggesting that everyone could be one, and even within the military, and that was the basic premise. And then they asked the audience to start chanting, "No to sectarian violence, yes to one nation." This is right on the side of the Tigris River. At first there was a few people standing around, then more and more people started to show up. And then there ended up being roughly 300 people there, all chanting "No to sectarian violence, yes to one nation." It was tremendously emotive. Like as people started joining, they started crying. So because there'd been so much violence, like even the month that Mark and I were there had been more bombings that month than I think any other time since the war ended. It was like a really, really horrible month. In fact, every day we'd hear bombs go off, and there'd be like clouds of smoke in the air. It was really just kind of an insane time. And so I think everyone there was feeling it, and of course they'd had enough. And so it was tremendously emotional. And then the protesters did this amazing thing. After they had everybody sort of cross the threshold already and being together in the protest, like they slowly brought them in with music. Basically, the chanting was musical. They were all there, as one. They took this giant scroll, and they put the scroll out on the ground. It was huge. And they passed out red ink pads to everyone in the audience. They had boxes of them, so that they could put their fingers in the ink and then put them on the scroll, committing to a non-violent, future for Iraq, a country that was won without religious prejudice. And it was tremendous. I mean, literally like hundreds of people in tears. And so then we realized structurally what they had done was just really brilliant. The way they brought everybody together, in the moment very slowly. It was very methodic, through chanting, got people involved, had some imagery that had a lot of humor to it, although the topic was quite serious. So there was sort of some irony involved and some humor, even, you might even say some satire in it. And then as people joined, collectively, the momentum started to pick up. Like it became motored. Like the whole event started to just, I think initially in sort of our terminology would say they began from a relatively quotidian moment, a time of quotidian consciousness. And then what happened is, as people became more self-conscious and aware of their presence and the impact of what they were talking about, we would say that their consciousness became more reflexive. They became more aware of themselves within this context and within this space. And then as it became a little more confusing as with regard to what was actually happening, as to some extent the feedback loop that one would anticipate was starting to break down a little bit. Like first there's everyone's together, but then they bring out the scroll and there's a moment where it's just getting bigger and bigger, and there's a kind of transition. So we would call that, if it's coming more sort of visceral, kind of electric, kind of intellectual, it's visceral electric, like it's intensifying. And so through that intensification, there's a moment where of vulnerability among the audience, because they're trying to process all their emotions, all the trauma, everything that's happening, the community, the references to the different religions, the locality of the event, all these things at once are sort of being computed in a way that things are developing to a kind of disjunctive synthesis. Things are coming apart and they're coming together. So in this moment, when they put the scroll down and people commit with their own blood, like literally where they're feeling like they're using their own blood, they had what we would refer to as kind of an unexperiencable experience, a post-phenomenological experience, a moment where you cross a threshold, of affect without having any control. So this was essentially a transversal moment. And on the other side of that was a feeling of community that included everyone there with so much power that, I mean, it was so visceral that we were just like, this is incredible. You really felt everyone there together and everyone unified. So I would say that this was a moment of epiphany for us, where we realized that there is a structure, and I think it was really well calculated on the part of the performance activists in this context. So, so now, I mean, there's so many examples that we can give. I mean, we've been working in this area for such a long time in so many places, many of which are kind of, explained in or at least discussed in our book, but so many more we couldn't include in the book. But let me just now jump to Nabi Saleh. So on this day that we participated in the protests in Nabi Saleh, it was like, every Friday for 7 years in Nabi Saleh, is the Nabi Saleh Solidarity organizes a protest on Friday afternoon. Locals and internationals participate. Many Israelis participate in it to protest the occupation. And that day when, we walked down with, everybody, basically the protest is simply a walk from the main part of the village down to the line between zones B and C, and just chanting in defiance of occupation. That's simply what it is. And the Tamimis, they record everything as it takes place. And what they do then is they edit it and they put it up on their YouTube channel. But when they do it, they actually kind of hope things are going to go a little south. They want something to happen there. So it's a more eventful, protest that can get them more international attention and support. So the children, including their own daughter, Ahed Tamimi, who many of you may have heard of, a tremendously courageous person who became, in a sense, the face of anti-occupation movement. She and her cousins, they typically really antagonize the IDF soldiers. They sit there and they yell at them and they curse at them and they try to provoke them into violence. Because if they can get them to act in a way violently toward the children, then all of a sudden, then people can see how horrible the situation is. So on this day, we're marching down, and some of the kids in the protests actually threw rocks at the soldiers. If you throw a rock at an IDF soldier, I mean, they're on some level mandated to kill you. Like they can do it days later. They don't need to do it on the day of the event. I mean, there's plenty of stories in which retaliation would happen later, or their homes are stink bombed, or something else happens, or they're just abducted and taken away or arrested. I mean, it's if you throw a rock, I mean, you're basically that's an act of violence, against them. And so these kids started with their slingshots, and then the soldiers just opened fire. And what they shoot is steel marbles covered in plastic. Also, rubber bullets that are also rubber over steel. And then they let loose with the tear gas. So you have the tear gas going over your head. You have the marbles whizzing by you that if one hits a soft area in your body, it'll penetrate. And literally instantly, a kid next to me that might have been maybe 8 or 9 years old was shot in the head in that protest that you saw. And he just dropped on the ground screaming. And I was like, whoa. And then his friends like instantly grabbed him and carried him off the field. His mother was waiting on the sidelines of the protest. So she's there, screaming, they're bringing him over. I start running back. If you looked at the video that we shared, I'm actually running with the camera. I tried to mention that while Mark was talking, but I didn't realize I was muted. But you can see in this moment running, and you can get a feeling of the intensity. And so then toward the end, when Mark and I kind of came together while he was helping the paramedic who was shot in the chest that you saw toward the end of the video, we did have this moment that Mark mentioned that we realized, wow, this is really this whole thing is a performance. The IDF soldiers are participating in the performance. They're literally like on the phone talking to the Tamimis about when is enough. It's like everything's coordinated. People are filming it. Like the whole thing was staged. And there's a term in performance studies that's called ostension. It's when you're included in a performance against your will. So Umberto Eco coined this term. And so I started to think about, do the children really want to be here? And do they really know what's at stake? What is, I mean, it seems like they couldn't really know the extent of what could happen to them under those conditions, especially given so many of them were between 5 and 10 years old. And even in the morning before we went out that day, we did like a little yoga session in the morning outside. And there were some kids practicing with their slingshots, and they were like 7 and 8 years old. And so this we found, particularly upsetting. So we got the idea of maybe doing a theater performance, in a collaboration with the Freedom Theater that would address the use of children in protests. Really kind of interrogate, their kind of deployment, in a sense, appropriation, and really get a better understanding for how such a mode is justifiable. And so that evening, Mark and I talked with Bassam and Bill El Tamimi, and asked them, first of all, how they felt about having their kids, in protests. And they said, well, from the moment they're born, they're fighting occupation. So they should be fully involved in, in the anti-occupation movement, from birth, because their freedom depends on it. And then we asked about about them, being in harm's way, and they said, well, it's necessary. And so then I suggested, hey, would you guys mind if we did a theater performance about this? And could we have access to your archive so we could get all your videos, so we could create a performance that's immersive, that situates the audience in the actual protests as a kind of design element, so that the audience would then feel the intensity of it while it's happening, while we're doing the show on stage. And they said that was a great idea. They absolutely wanted us to have access to all their material. And then the story is quite a bit longer one, I know I'll go for maybe a few more minutes. I'm not sure exactly how much time we have to tell how the whole
About 2 more minutes, Bryan.
Okay. Okay, so how the whole Nabi Saleh project played out. But I mean, we did end up doing a collaboration with the Freedom Theater that we performed in Jenin in the Cinema Jenin Theater, which was later destroyed. Um, it turned out that the performers were fantastic. It turned out to be a very powerful performance, but a lot of things happened in process. Initially, the actors refused to do the play, even after the artistic director was fully supportive of it. And we arrived there because we had an Israeli character in the play. And they said that while in Nabi Saleh, Israelis support them, in Jenin, nobody does. It would nobody go there. So I rewrote the play, we retranslated it into Arabic, we had another meeting, and now they wanted to go forward because they also want the play to offer some hope. So I had Ahed Tamimi stealing a military vehicle and driving to the sea. Had a very sensational ending to it, while a lot of horror happened along the way. And so then the basic rehearsal process was challenged with all kinds of events. It was the whole, which would take me longer to explain. It was a really intense time, but we really developed a really great community. And all of us that worked on it together really, I mean, if I were to speak longer, I would talk about the importance of the process of producing a work and how that alone is already a huge intervention. It has a lot of potential. You know, it's like the impact, becomes exponential. I think when you're on the ground working with people on site and really, listening to their experiences and taking the time to get to know them, I think this is really crucial. And then I would say ultimately, and this is I'm going to be really brief when I say this, but the performance didn't really achieve what we had hoped. It what we made a miscalculation, and that was that the design that we did was a little too abstract. It was too intermediate, it had like design with the immersive experience. Like I would say that I personally underestimated the extent to which the show or the impact of the show triggering the audience in ways they were going to find too overwhelming, just too much. And as we got close to the performance, one of the choreographers from the Freedom Theater mentioned that this might be an issue, and she started to feel it. And I'd remembered a year before talking with her that their productions, the intention typically is just to create a kind of feedback loop, to a sense play back to the community, as Ben does in playback theater, what their experiences are like, to affirm for them the realities that they have to contend with, but not to interrogate them. In a sense, our show was more, it interrogated, it was to some extent an indictment and planned to get a conversation going about how we care for our children. And so in the end, while I think it was a terrific show and it was great for everyone involved, for the audience, the discussion went on for 2 hours after the show, and people were very upset. And I would say that, and most times when I make theater, if people are upset afterwards, I like that. Like, I think that's good. I want them to be upset because I feel like it's through discomfort that we grow. You have to be uncomfortable to grow, but I don't think that's the best mode in every context. And I think that was something that I learned from this experience, to how to measure better, or modulate, in fact, mitigate impact. I know that was more than 2 minutes, and so let me stop. Thank you.
Can I add something real quick, Ben? Just a bit of context.
Sure.
Sure. No, it's just very funny. It is true that there was a tension, and in the theater where it was staged was a very intense reaction. And when we played it for the Tamimis, when we went to Nabi Saleh and played it for them, they didn't have any of that reaction. It was much. They just thought it was good. And so even within a society, within different locations of people in the same struggle, they can view something very differently, right? And even in a place as small as the West Bank, Jenin is a very different place than Nabi Saleh. right? The environment there, the experience with outsiders. Now we also went to prison to where Zakaria Zubeidi was imprisoned in Ramallah or under protective custody and played it for him. He's from Jenin, but he's used to working with all kinds of people, and he thought he gave it his stamp of approval too. So it's very interesting how different people, how theater can affect it differently in different people. But I think it is true that, in a conflict, if your goal is to provoke change and motor people to a different consciousness, how do you do that when people are on the losing end of a century-long struggle for existence? Like, is that the role of theater? Should theater be to affirm? Maybe Bryan, if there's any time, could talk about his experience in Ukraine recently, while the bombs were falling, literally doing theater and seeing theater being performed there. I don't know, Bryan, because we never spoke about it. If which way the theater that you saw falls between the kind of theater, the way you wrote Nabi Saleh and the way you wanted it staged in Jenin, the provocation you were trying to do, and then realizing maybe that doesn't work there, to our theater makers in Ukraine, having to go through the same challenges and processes. But I do know that in other work I've done in Kakuma and refugee camps in Africa, in the Niger Delta, in Kenya and Congo, working in Congo with musicians, that it also is very hard because you want to use the art to challenge, and it can't be revolutionary if it doesn't challenge the entirety of the situation. On the other hand, it's very hard to challenge too much because people are suffering already enough and they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to confront certain things. So this, I think, is a huge challenge. And we see it today in all the protests that are in the US, these No Kings protests. You also have millions of people coming out very much critical of Trump, but no one critical of sort of the internal dynamics within the Democratic Party or Democratic ideology that made Trump possible. So it's this is an ongoing dynamic I think artists who want to do politics have to confront. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Bryan. I wish we had more time because you both have such a rich and vast experience to share. But I would like to give time for people to ask questions and for you to respond to those questions. But first, we'll hand over to Hazel Hurley, who will share with us a visual summary, a graphic harvest of what we've heard so far. And as we're taking in that image, please write your questions in the chat. So we'll take about 2 minutes now. And as mentioned, please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat. So thank you, Hazel, for that beautiful graphic. We'll be sharing that later through our social media channels. I see a first question here from Melissa asking how you fund your work.
I think that that's a complex question. You know, for every project, and now there's been, so many, it's always a different source from which we, seek funding depending on what we're doing. I would say the biggest funder of work for transversal theater has been the European Commission. Um, but you have to have some sort of project that falls within the scope of a call that they have. But I would say probably the biggest funder of our work is ourselves. Mark and I, we just live perpetually in debt, you know, and I think that we're probably most responsible for our own funding. Um, but for each,
We've got money from European universities and the EU when a decade ago when it was funding things dealing with immigration and there was a moment when these kind of things were more easily funded. Now in the US, of course, all kind of funding like this has literally been canceled by the Trump administration and replaced by funding that focuses entirely on fighting anti-Semitism, literally like the National Endowment for the Humanities. So yeah, it's us and trying to make it work somehow. But someone had a question about are we saying uh just trying to see it.
There's a question from Karen here that says, when you were saying that events happening in
Yes.
Palestine were like a
Yeah,
theater play, what do you mean by
yeah.
this?
Yeah. I mean, it's not that they were like a theater play. It was that and this worked for Nabi Saleh. It can work for some scenes. If anyone's old enough to remember the first Intifada, there were these kind of set scenes with set scripts, kids with with slingshots, young men usually with slingshots, and then the Israeli soldiers usually with a tank in back of them and riot gear and so on, blocking the rocks, and then they would shoot back. There becomes a script and it becomes a story, and it becomes a story that is narrativable, narration, able to be narrated. And and what we wanted to do is, if Nabi Saleh every week for hundreds of times, what we call performances, this would be staged. They literally would stage the protest, right, which is a verb you use about a protest. It would be recorded, it would be uploaded, tens of thousands of people would watch it. Each one more or less followed the same pattern, the same narration, basically a script. And what became obvious to us is like Bryan was saying, there was communication. I don't know who in the family it was at any particular time, but one of the elders of the village would somehow be in touch with the military, and when the military wanted to leave, they would let people know, you guys got to stop now. And if people didn't stop, they would start shooting closer to people's heads instead of above them or at the ground. And and it served both people's purposes in a way. It was very important for Palestinians because it got the word out to the world, what was happening, what the occupation was really like. Their land was still being taken from them. And somehow, for a moment, for the IDF and for the Israeli government, it showed some sort of leniency towards resist. They weren't just mowing people down who resisted them. And of course, the fact that in places like Bilin and Nabi Saleh and Sheikh Jarrah and the Jordan Valley, there were people who had become internationally known, no one more so than Ahed Tamimi and her cousin, maybe as well, Noura. It meant that it gave it a little more space, right, to do that. One should point out that her cousin, another member of the family, was killed. Other members were severely injured and jailed, and she herself was in prison. So it wasn't like they got a free pass at all. But there was a moment where, when you had 10 or 15 internationals there, and even Israelis, while they were protesting, who were standing right near them, the IDF wasn't going to shoot children right in front of them, and that allowed them to say things which then would go public and exhibit defiance that otherwise wouldn't exist. And I've seen this, in Nigeria where there were protests. This wouldn't have been able to happen. They would have been, let's say, shot, right? People would have been killed. And I've seen that happen too. That gave birth to a new company, what became known as Chicoco, or the Collaborative Media Advocacy Platform, that we then went on to create a group that started creating new music and theater and other things that to show the condition of people in the slums, the waterfront slums of Port Harcourt, very much inspired by what Bryan had written and what we had done together in Nabi Saleh. So it's clear that protests can be scripted in a way. The question is, when does the script reinforce power and when does the script challenge power? And at what point does it change? And how do you, as the creator, the author, the composer, stay ahead of that and keep the script changing enough so that you can keep power somehow off balance? And I think that's where it stays beyond the edge.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have a lot of questions, but we have 4 minutes to wrap up. I think maybe I can choose one question and see how it goes from there. We have a question from Mary. Please describe the various theater venues for these performances. Are theater owners and managers willing to give you access to their indoor, outdoor venues, or do you usually use public spaces?
I mean, it really depends where we're working. I mean, typically we try to gain access to a theater space, but every project is a different kind of project. I mean, when working in Tanzania and Zanzibar, we did a project that was with children or youth that was designed to kind of expose corruption in the community and different people that were abusing them. So what we had done was listen to their stories, created plays with the children in 3 different communities, then perform the plays back to the communities is a way by which to indict their perpetrators, not specifically by name, but by like the everyone that's been responsible for or irresponsible with regard to their safety. Because oftentimes sex and money is extorted from kids and their families in order for them to progress in the school system. And to do those shows in each location, we did them in a different kind of venue, whether it be at a school, in a classroom, or whether it was in a courtyard, or something like that. So I would say that it really depends on what's available.
Maybe thank you so much. Maybe I will end with one last question. In such spaces and experiences, how do you take care of your physical and mental well-being?
Um, I mean, I'm sure Mark has something to say about it. I just, I don't know. I mean, I think that you just, like, I want to say that it's really important to realize that the work we're doing is very small. Like, we're not accomplishing very much. We're there just, if we're doing anything at all, it feels like we're doing something. And the experiencing of doing it and working with people is so rewarding that I think that somehow, kind of really mitigates the kind of trauma of doing it. Because you can't forget things you've seen. Once you've seen things, they're with you forever. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things. And the other thing is that, we leave. Every place we go to work, we don't stay there and we leave. And so with that departure comes guilt. And I think there's a lot to be said about this.
Yeah.
And I think too much to say so quickly, but I don't think there's any easy answer to that question.
No.
Yeah.
I would just say, I think, as I wrote in the chat, a lot of it, the healing comes from the solidarity with the people with whom you're working. We didn't mention Chiapas, but we spent time in Chiapas, and I worked at the Comparte Festival in 2017, the Zapatista-sponsored theater festival, and theater and music festival in the Zapatista-controlled areas. And the same thing there. And also when we've both been in Pakistan, it's about solidarity and it's about this kind of intersectional cross-cultural solidarity where you're literally in the process of doing the creative work and activism. You are creating an identity that supersedes whatever you came in with, that joins you to people. And that is a joyful thing. That actually is joyful. So even if it is dangerous at sometimes, or very disheartening at all times to do this kind of work. It's also very heartening, and it produces a level of joy and connection. Well, here we are with Ben, 12 years later, and Ben and I have done a million things together. A year after we did this play, we were in Cairo together, working with Syrian refugees in Tahrir Square while Tahrir was being occupied by the revolutionaries. And then Ben created Dawar, and then we were doing stuff there. And it's just a constant movement. And I think that's what gives you some hope. Because if we weren't doing this, at least me, I would be hopeless for the world. This is the only thing that keeps me hopeful, is doing these kind of things. So even though they're small, that at least means something is possible. Maybe Bambara was wrong. Art doesn't make revolution irresistible. It makes at least the possibility of it seem possible, which is perhaps as good as we can hope for at the moment.
Thank you so much. Allow me to end here.